Okay, and welcome everyone. We are in the Turkish pavilion of the Venice Architecture Biennale. Alkestie Skarlatou is our guest today, and she is a trained architect, and she was trained in Bartle School of Architecture for lighting design also, and did her PhD thesis on the same subject. And she's a professional member of the Association for International Lighting Designers, and so she has a lot of practical work and academic work also. And thank you for being here, Alkestie, and we can start.
Okay, thank you very much for having me. Let me just now share the screen again and go to the presentation that I have done for this. Can you see my screen now? Is the document visible to you?
Yes, it is.
Okay, great. Okay, so I wanted to start by saying that as you heard, my background is in architecture. So after finishing architecture, I moved into the lighting world, but I still carry much of the concepts of what I was taught about lighting in architecture school. And I thought that this would be the case for most of the architecture students that you have in the pavilion right now. And hopefully I can share some of my experience in lighting, but also some of my thoughts on a more theoretical level about lighting and architecture, and some misconceptions that I see on the everyday basis through my experience here in the UK, but also in other countries. Lighting designer and architects work very closely together, and in the most successful projects, they involve some relationship of trust. In the less successful, so there is a bit of a clash between ideas of what light should be about. So I would start about what is actually a light. When I graduated, I pretty much thought it was identical to a luminaire. So I would call the luminaires lights. Those were the lights, and I find that many architects in meetings also say, "Can you put some lights there?" So if we step back for a minute and think what actually a luminaire is a 3-dimensional object. In the old times, it used to be a handmade object, but now it's an industrial object. So there is a lot of thought around what the industrial design of it, and there's a whole industry for industrial lighting designers that move into architectural lighting because of that. It is also an object of beauty, so we tend to think about lights as decorative objects as well. And most of all, it's a tool. And just to illustrate that, just go back into the history. I would just pick one type of light, which is the chandelier, and I put together a story of how the chandelier evolved, and that gives an idea what makes it an object and not a light, basically. So I did this research for a project that I've done recently. In the beginning, they were candles, as we all know. That was the only thing you can light a space with. And then people in public spaces, such as churches or halls, decided they want more light. So they put more candles, and then they decided that they should raise them far up. And then they created a very simple construction, as you can see, where they just put more lights and they raised it up in a hall. And they decided that this was the best place because the light would spread out and fill in the space. And that's how the notion of the chandelier began. Then obviously candles were not very powerful light sources, so they decided to put more candles. The more powerful and more wealthy an institution or a person was, the more chandeliers and the more candles they would afford to. So it became also linked to being affluent. Then they invented obviously the crystal and the glass, and they understood that diffraction and can spread the light even more and make it more efficient as a source and more beautiful as an object. The next step was that the gas was invented, so we moved away from candles, and then the light was coming from the source was even brighter. So there was a need to shield that light and then diffuse it, make it softer, so reduce the problem of glare that appeared only then. The next step was to invent electrical light, which was even more powerful than the gas light. And there was no reason anymore to have the candles up because there was no wax dripping. So the source is turned downwards. And thus we see how function affected the form of the chandelier. And in the contemporary years, we started playing with new materials such as fiber optics and perspex and cloth materials and laser cuts and 3D printed objects to create chandeliers which were more about aesthetics. So in my opinion, this is how you took a functional thing, which was a candle, made it into an aesthetic thing, which is a chandelier. And that is often confused between interior designer, architecture professionals, that a decorative object is more an object of beauty and it doesn't necessarily offer enough, because then we don't need so much light anymore because we have other lighting engineering luminaires to produce a quantity of light we need. Now, this was a long story, but I will explain how it ties in together. So the second misconception or concept that most architects have is that light is a service, and it's not really a misconception. It is a service. The most iconic of all being the Pompidou Center in Paris, where the architects famously colored all the services with a different color codes. Yellow being the electrical service, electricity. So light was electricity, and it's a very to me iconic way at the stage of history of architecture where it shows that lighting is considered and service is the same as air circulating or a transport or other forms of services within a building. In the contemporary years, this is more celebrated. We have the open ceilings, which to many architects mean a kind of honesty in the structure, that you don't conceal things, you don't use plasterboards, you just have open ceilings, and light should be with its conduits, something very, very visible. And then the tracks are not concealed anymore. And then you just you have your conduit, the power goes through, you just pop in the light dots. You need more light, you pop more light dots, and that's how you finish your light scheme basically. If it's a big space, you put many dots. If it's a small space, you put less dots. And then there is a third way to think about light, which is light is a phenomenon. It is different from the other two because it's not something you can touch. It's intangible, and it only becomes visible when it hits a surface, when it hits the architectural envelope. And it can take many forms. It's a subjective thing. It can give space a form within a controlled environment. And when we say controlled environment, it can be either the interior of an architectural space. It can be the theater, which I consider to be the lab of lighting, because you effectively have a blank space and you create effects and magic out of nothing. And generally it's something that cannot be touched, or it's not like a material like a cement or something. It's a little bit more elusive than that, and it's definitely not an object. So after a few years, I kind of shifted from my initial architectural concept of light being a luminaire into light being a phenomenon. And then the things we create with light, I used to call them light effects rather than lights. The whole thinking behind it is lighting design, to my opinion. So then it comes the next stage where light is a phenomenon, but then the light effects are created because we manipulate this phenomenon, we focus it, so we can change the beam from very small to very wide. We reflect it, so we just redirect the light beam. We diffuse it, so we make it softer. We take something very harsh such as electrical light and make it softer. We refract it. We use it to spread out and create nice effects, we dim it and we filter it with filters that change its beam or change its color, or do all sorts of things. And why do we consider all of those changes as pleasant? Why do we spend so much effort in labs in creating all those highly engineered micro filters and then put them into luminaires or into the space? And why has lighting become such a specialist field that it needs a specialist to advise the architect and the client of what they should do and why they should invest money in it? I think because light is a phenomenon and we tend to like nature, that we all experience different forms of it in our life, and our memories, our fond memories, are made of these phenomena of light. So, for example, when we focus light and we create a very sharp beam, this can be met in nature. When we reflect light into a specular surface, such as the water surface, we've seen that many times and we loved it. When we spread light with a diffuser behind an opal surface, we've seen that in the fog and the mist, in the haze, and that's sometimes what we try to recreate in interior environments with backlighting opal surfaces, for example. Or we've seen it being refracted into the glass of our windows or somewhere else. And then we've seen it dim every night the sun goes down. It does slowly dim the lights, basically, and all the nature around us and the cities just change. And we love that. We love that change. We love this intensively lit environment becoming quieter, and that's what we try to recreate in interior spaces as well. And it's also filtered. We've seen the light being filtered through the trees, and this is one of the things we admire most when we walk in the forest. So this is basically, I think this is a more rich definition of what light is. It is a phenomenon, and it's only visible when it hits the surface, whether that's a big surface, an architectural surface, or whether it's small particles in the air that are floating, such as dust or smoke. So light can take the shape of space, but also space can be formed by light. And this is where the job of the lighting designer comes in. So at the end of this, I have 3 case studies I picked from the work I've done all these years, and I think they're very nice for these examples because they give, because they have a very clear idea of the space, and then the light comes and informs the idea instead of creating a patchwork of things. So one of the very first things I've done is this house in Psychiko in Athens, where the architect had a very strong view. As you can see on the globe plan on the left-hand side, there was a very solid wall going through the plots, and then everything else was glass overlooking the pool. So he wanted to put a line of light following that circulation, and I told him, if you want to create this linearity with light, you should move the lights close to the solid wall and then let the light be reflected back into the space. So this is the main idea that goes to be repeated in all the house, and then you can see how through the glass you can see this solid wall. Unfortunately, I don't have a picture that shows in the real life, but you can see how the light reflects back into the space, and then how this is also recreated in details in the basement. I think it was quite a successful project because that was one single thing that we kept to, and we tried to make it work across the whole of the house. Another project that I've worked to that's a much bigger scale and much more complicated, it's the Knightsbridge facade in a very central area in London. I'm sure people who've been to London have been there. So it's a whole block in a very commercial, high-end area in London. And there was one owner that owned all of those buildings and wanted to create a lighting scheme so that it unifies the property and upscales it so that more retailers and more residents want to move into and compete with the Harrods building, which is on this side, and the Harvey Nichols building, which are very big competitors, very well known retailers on that side. So squashed between those two retailers, this block wanted an identity by night. Looking at the architecture of this, we thought that the most important element is verticality. You had very, very narrow plots of land and Flemish-looking style buildings, which were formed into a base, a torso, and a crown. But because of the narrow plot, they were formed in a vertical. So the only common thing those buildings from different periods had was this verticality. Once we identified this in the architecture, then the lighting came in and we said we should light the verticals first and then everything else should be on the side, because this is what it is. This is what it's going to be about. And we can respect the colors of the building by using warm tones in the brick facades and cool tones in the stone facades. But even though we have this variation in the color temperature, the verticality is still the strongest element of this scheme that was considered quite successful. We were quite proud that it won an award. And I still believe it's about the consistency of the idea rather than putting lights here and there. So that was the second case, and then the third case is also one very prestigious big project, which is the Crossrail. It's a very big transport project that takes place in London right now and tries to connect the east and the west side of the city and extend outwards in a very high speed and very latest technology trains, but also has a lot of technical issues of safety and a new material. So I was part of the team that was responsible for the spaces that were underground and not the overground presentation of the stations. Here, I think that even though the technicalities were very restrictive, there was again a very clear message which we formed together with the architects, and it was the orientation and the legibility of the space. So the most important thing was not so the aesthetic, even though the aesthetic was quite high. It is a very, very nice looking interior station, but it was, so how can passengers move from point 1 to point 2 in the most easy way without doubting and without feeling disoriented or suppressed in an underground space. And for this reason, we went for uplighting the vault of that so that it can create openness for a basement level. And it was a very hard thing to do because uplighting is not a very efficient way to light the space. It doesn't give you much back, and you had challenges of heat sinks everything being incorporated in those structures, the totem structures. There was lots of mock-ups being done, and in terms of materials also, we had to choose materials that were not that they were shatterproof and all of the other safety issues. But again, the way people drive down the escalators in a continuity of light lines, which are diffused and treated for glare, and also in the main concourse and how they find their way into the platforms, it is very much so about keeping the light levels, but also providing eligibility and orientation. And this is what the lighting has been about, together with the other parts. So I would say that young architects moving into projects where they have to consider lighting, I think they need to take a step back and think first, what does the space need to achieve? What is the main concept in terms of lighting? Then what does the light need to do? And then this is a place where the lighting designer works with the architect and decide that what should we light, what shouldn't we light. And in most cases, the things you're not supposed to light are equally important, because if you light everything, then you flatten everything out and you lose your main element. And then the first step is, how can it be done? And then it's the time to think about the luminaires, which are the tools of lighting. They are the means of achieving what is the main idea, rather than thinking about, oh, I want these very lovely lights and I want them to be over this counter. I think this is my personal belief, this is the wrong approach, and I think we should start from the ideas in the same way as we do with architecture, begin with a concept that then becomes materialized into resolving it, rather than the other way around. And yeah, so I think this diagram represents most of all what would be what is my approach in how I approach projects, but also what I advise others, and I try to work with architects in the same way. So that was it. Thank you very much for that. And I'm not sure if there's any questions on that material or in the general practice of lighting.
Thank you very much. And if there are it was a very nice and brief and very to the point presentation. Thank you. And
Great. Great.
I wanted to say it was illuminating, but it would be a bad pun, so I will spare it. But thank you very much, Alkestie. And
welcome.
Is there anyone who wants to ask about the practice of lighting design in architecture? I have a question, if you will.
Sure.
Are there any cases that brief comes to you in very early stages of design? So maybe you have a word on like surface materials, because you know how they will reflect or how they will behave under the different lighting conditions. You may feel that like this is a hard thing to do with this space, but if architect asked me before choosing this material, or you may have experienced things like that. So are there any cases that lighting is considered in early stages?
Yes, that's a good question. I didn't really talk about materials at all because it was a very short time, but they do play a very important role in lighting. And even at an early stage or at a late stage, we do tend to say to the architects that reflective materials might not be what you expect, because there's going to be 1,000 mirror images of your downlights. So reflections are very, very important. Also, dark materials versus light materials. I very often come to cases where I'm presented in scheme with very, very dark surfaces, and that is fine. But then the architects believe that the space is going to be bright. You just put more lights in it. We try to explain that, look, it's physics. Black absorbs all the light. So no matter how many lights we put in, it's still going to be a very moody space. Are you sure you want that? And then just take a step back and think about it. And that is the successful part, because when we do discuss those things about the surfaces and the reflectances, and they are taken into consideration, then the result is what the architect has expected, or the interior designer. In cases where you just find out last minute, it is not it's not a good surprise. I think people do believe that yeah, a black space can still be very bright if you put lots of light in it, and I'm afraid it's not the case. But also in an era where we have more complex materials, I find the case that sometimes the light LEDs are integrated into them, and then magical effects can take place into making them glow in very unexpected ways. So yeah, they're quite important to be discussed at early stages. Yeah.
Anyone else? So if there isn't anyone else, I will ask another among myself. So light itself is how we understand, if we understand correctly, a very chaotic material. It's not easy to calculate properly. Are there any challenges of modeling? For example, do you do 3D models with materials, or are the digital modeling tools are giving you enough? So what are the modeling challenges?
So there's different levels of modeling. So there are very basic tools that give you the quantity of light. They tell you if your levels are sufficient in the surface, which is the important one. For example, you're sitting on a desk now. That is your task surface, and then what is happening around you is not so important, but the calculations should be important about what's happening in your desk, and that is your task surface. If you're doing a video conferencing, then it's very important what is the light on the face of the viewer. So we would focus, we would drop vertical surfaces and then calculate how much light is coming into the face and if the modeling is good. But then when you want to create photorealistic images and then use more sophisticated models, then it is again a collaboration between the visualizer and the lighting designer to to refine the things so that they look more or less what they would be. But to me, it is always also an artistic interpretation. You have to have an eye for it. Unless you use extremely sophisticated software that runs for days, then I think the rest of the modeling needs the eye of an artist. Let's put it that way to make it, because light is an impression of the moment. Really, it's not what it's going to look throughout the day and throughout the seasons. You just need to pick up the right balance and the right impression.
And if anyone else wants to contribute, okay, so let's finish it here then. And thank you very much for joining us from the Alkestie, and thank you very much for everything you shared.
Thank you very much. I hope it was interesting a bit to the students, and I wish you a very successful completion of your next degree and the Biennale.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.